Since time immemorial, long before the advent of information technology capable of instantly conveying thoughts to billions, ancient leaders possessed an amazing and sometimes frightening skill: the ability to control huge masses of people. This art did not depend on modern means of communication, such as the internet, television, or even radio broadcasting. Their tools were much subtler and deeper, rooted in the fundamental foundations of the human psyche. They did not simply give orders, they knew how to masterfully play on the strongest emotions, fears, hopes, and collective beliefs, directing crowds of thousands and sometimes millions to their goals, be it peaceful creation, the building of grandiose empires, or furious conquests. The ancient world, with its limited resources, lack of advanced logistics, and constant struggle for survival, required rulers not only to have physical strength or military genius, but also a sophisticated understanding of what motivated individuals in a group. In an environment where ignorance was the norm and information was slow and often distorted, the ability to influence hearts and minds directly, without going through logical reasoning, was key to long-term retention of power. These ancient masters of manipulation, whether Egyptian pharaohs, Roman emperors, Greek tyrants, Chinese emperors, or barbarian tribal chieftains, intuitively or consciously developed and honed a set of psychological techniques that allowed them not just to control, but to inspire, unite, and direct crowds, transforming disparate individuals into a single powerful organism, capable of great achievements or horrific destruction. Amazingly, many of these techniques, developed thousands of years ago in very different social and cultural contexts, remain remarkably relevant today. They show that the basic mechanisms of human perception, group decision-making, identity formation, and responses to threats or promises have remained virtually unchanged. Studying these ancient strategies is more than just a historical exploration. It is an opportunity to understand the deep principles of social influence that continue to operate in our world. Today we'll look at 5 key psychological tricks that underpinned successful crowd control in ancient times. We'll dive into the essence of each of them, look at historical examples of their application, and explain what psychological mechanisms made them so effective. We will see how ancient leaders skillfully used the creation of a common enemy to unite their society, how an appeal to a higher power or divine approval gave their power a sacred and unquestionable character, how the use of symbols and rituals created a powerful non-verbal language that united people, how the creation of myths and legends formed a common history and identity, linking the past with the present and the future, and finally, how the control of information, combined with the manipulation of fear and hope, allowed them to completely control reality in the minds of their subjects. Each of these tricks, individually and in combination, formed a complex system of control that allowed the leaders of the past to decide the destinies of millions. And I propose to proceed to the first, because among all the psychological tricks that ancient leaders used to control huge masses of people, the creation of the image of a common enemy stands out for its amazing effectiveness and versatility. This method exploits one of the deepest and most basic human instincts, the instinct for survival and the desire to unite in the face of a threat. When people feel threatened from the outside, or it seems to them that their existence is threatened, they instinctively cast aside all internal disagreements, personal grievances, social contradictions, and even everyday envy. All their strength, energy, and attention are instantly switched to confronting this common danger that the leader points out. This trick is so powerful that it has been used throughout human history, from primitive communities and tribal unions to the greatest empires of antiquity, and its principles remain incredibly relevant today, demonstrating the immutability of the basic mechanisms of the human psyche. Imagine an ancient city, or perhaps a large tribal settlement, where internal strife was constantly raging. It could be disputes between different families over access to water or fertile land, conflicts between traders and farmers, or even power struggles between noble families. Such internal tensions could easily lead to chaos, weakening the community and even its disintegration. In this situation, a wise, or rather cunning, leader with a deep understanding of crowd psychology could point to an external source of threat. It could be a neighboring, stronger and more warlike tribe which was supposedly preparing to attack and enslave. Or, for example, a chief could declare that a drought, famine, or epidemic tormenting the community was caused by a curse or the malicious actions of some hostile spirits, and only by common, consolidated efforts under his wise leadership could these forces be appeased or driven out. The main condition for the success of this tactic was that this enemy was not just an abstract concept, but something as understandable, tangible, and capable of evoking the strongest, even primal emotions. Deep fear for one's own life, for the safety of children and women, anger at injustice and the threat to their way of life, as well as a frantic desire to protect one's home, one's family, and one's land at any cost. The most striking example of this strategy is the history of ancient Rome. When the Roman Senate or consuls needed to mobilize all forces for a large-scale and exhausting military campaign, they regularly resorted to the tactic of demonizing the enemy. During the Punic Wars, especially during the confrontation with Carthage, this city-state was presented to the Romans not just as a geopolitical competitor for dominance in the Mediterranean, but as an absolute, incarnate evil whose existence threatened the very foundation of Roman civilization, its values, and its future. The great Carthaginian general Hannibal was portrayed not just as a talented and dangerous opponent, but as a cunning, treacherous, incredibly cruel and ruthless barbarian who would stop at no atrocities to destroy Rome. Horrific stories of his war crimes, of the barbaric sacrifices allegedly committed by the Carthaginians, of their treachery and lack of moral principles were actively spread throughout the Republic. Such propaganda was aimed not simply at informing the population, it was intended to form a single, collective, and extremely negative image of the enemy, which would arouse burning rage, deep disgust, and an irresistible desire for revenge in every Roman citizen, from patrician to plebeian. The famous slogan of Cato the Elder, "Carthage must be destroyed," became the quintessence of this strategic attitude, transforming Rome's foreign policy from a simple clash of interests into a kind of moral crusade in which compromise was impossible and defeat meant the death of everything that was dear. This rhetoric actively cultivated the feeling of a besieged fortress in Roman society. All internal contradictions, be it the centuries-old struggle between patricians and plebeians for political rights, heated debates about land reforms, accusations of corruption among officials, or even ordinary everyday quarrels, were immediately pushed into the background, losing their relevance. After all, when the enemy is at the very gates, when a threat hangs over the entire state, there is no time for internal squabbles and settling scores. It is necessary to immediately unite and, with joint forces, defend the common cause, save your homeland. This emergency situation allowed leaders to consolidate their power incredibly effectively, justifying any, even the most harsh and unpopular decisions as absolutely necessary measures to save the fatherland. Raising taxes to unprecedented heights, forced military service that took men away for years, temporary restrictions on civil liberties, all of this was perceived not as tyranny, but as inevitable sacrifices in the name of common victory and survival. Fear and indignation, purposefully directed at an external object, became a powerful catalyst for collective identity and an effective tool for the large-scale mobilization of all society's resources, human, economic, and moral. However, as history shows, the common enemy was not always external. Historical chronicles are replete with examples of leaders appointing scapegoats within their own society. These could be religious or ethnic minorities, representatives of a certain social class, people with different political views, or even those who simply differed from the majority. This strategy allowed the pent-up popular discontent to be released, redirecting aggression and frustration onto a vulnerable group instead of addressing the true underlying causes of the problems. Creating an image of foreign, different, or extraordinary from the majority helped to single it out as the source of all troubles. From crop failures and epidemics to political intrigue and economic decline, this tactic is one of the most insidious and destructive, as it destroys the unity of society from within, sowing deep mistrust and hostility between its sections, and can lead to mass persecution, ostracism, and ultimately tragedy and genocide. But from the perspective of the ancient manipulators, it was an incredibly effective method of control, as it provided the mob with an easily identifiable target for their anger and allowed them to justify their own failures and suffering by blaming them on the enemy within. Vivid examples of such internal demonization are the persecution of early Christians in the Roman Empire, who were blamed for everything from fires in Rome to conspiracies against the emperor. or the centuries-long persecution of Jews in various European societies who were accused of the most absurd and malicious actions. The goal is always the same: to distract attention from the real problems and unite the majority against the internal enemy that allegedly undermines the foundations of society. The most important element here was the creation of negative stereotypes, attributing inhuman qualities, immorality, evil or vile intentions to the enemy. All this served one main goal: to dehumanize him, to deprive him of humanity, in order to make aggression against him not only acceptable, but also desirable, and sometimes necessary in the eyes of the crowd. Beyond outright demonization, leaders could use more subtle methods to create a common enemy. For example, it could be an abstract threat: the decay of morals, the decline of tradition, the corruption of the blood, or even ignorance, that an enlightened ruler must combat. Or the enemy could be the previous order, which was supposedly unjust and oppressive, and the new leader would emerge as a liberator. In either case, the idea of an enemy, either concrete or abstract, was a powerful motivator. Thus, the creation of a common enemy is a multifaceted, deeply psychological technique that affects the strongest and most basic layers of the human psyche. It allowed ancient leaders not just to govern, but to completely consolidate power, distract attention from internal problems, justify any, even the most severe actions, and most effectively mobilize the masses, playing on the strongest emotions: fear, anger, and the desire for security. Its astonishing versatility, adaptability to different contexts, and proven effectiveness over thousands of years prove that this trick has been and remains one of the most powerful and, unfortunately, overused pillars of crowd control in human history. The second, equally powerful and absolutely fundamental psychological trick that ancient leaders used widely and effectively was the appeal to a higher power or divine approval. In the vast majority of ancient societies, where religion was not just a part of life, but its all-encompassing framework, permeating every aspect of existence, from spring sowing and harvesting to the outbreak of war and everyday justice, from the birth of a new member of the community to funeral rites. The claim that the leader acted at the direct will of the gods, or was their chosen one, was not just a persuasive argument. It was an indisputable fact, a kind of axiom that no one could or dared to argue with. Such a connection with the divine transformed the ruler's earthly power into something sacred, raising his authority to a height absolutely unattainable for ordinary mortals. After all, who would dare challenge or question someone whose decisions, orders, and even life itself were sanctified and directed by heaven itself? It was a trick that ensured not only obedience, but also a deep, irrational awe. There are countless examples of this universal tactic throughout human history, demonstrating its global application and effectiveness. The pharaohs of ancient Egypt are perhaps the most striking embodiment of this concept. They did not simply rule over their people, they themselves were considered living gods, direct incarnations of the great god Horus on earth. Their birth, every detail of their lives, and even their deaths were part of a sacred divine cycle, inextricably linked to the cosmic order. Any command of the pharaoh was perceived not as a human decree, but as the direct and unquestionable will of the entire pantheon. Thus, resistance to the pharaoh was not simply an act of disobedience or political rebellion. It was sacrilege, a grave sin against the universe, which the Egyptians believed could bring the disfavor of the gods and terrible disasters upon the entire land. This divine status gave the pharaohs absolute and unlimited power over the life and death of their subjects, over all the resources of the state, and over the fate of every individual. Universal veneration, grandiose ceremonies in their honor, as well as the construction of colossal monumental structures, such as the Great Pyramids and magnificent temples, which served not only as cult centers, but also as eternal symbols of their divine, unshakable power. All this only strengthened this deep-rooted belief in the people. Every giant stone, every hieroglyph on the temple walls was a silent but convincing testimony to this divine power, overwhelming with its grandeur any timid thoughts of resistance or doubt. Similar concepts, albeit with local cultural variations, existed in other great civilizations. In China, for example, the emperor bore the sacred title of Son of Heaven, Tianzi, ruling under the mandate of heaven Tianming. This mandate was not something given once and for all. It was a condition that required the emperor to rule wisely and justly. As long as the emperor followed the Taoist way and demonstrated virtue, the country prospered, and his rule was considered divinely sanctioned. However, if natural disasters occurred, floods, earthquakes, droughts, mass uprisings, or humiliating military defeats, it was taken as a clear sign that the emperor had lost the mandate of heaven. Such a situation could serve as a legitimate justification for his overthrow and the rise of a new dynasty. Thus, this myth not only ensured amazing stability of rule over the millennia, but also acted as a kind of safety valve, allowing to explain the change of dynasties and dynastic crises without completely destroying the most fundamental idea of the divine legitimacy of supreme power. Even great military leaders, who initially made no claim to direct divine descent, were adept at using this trick to enhance their authority. Alexander the Great was one such master of PR. After his brilliant conquests in Egypt, he made a symbolic but crucial journey to the famous oracle of Amun at the remote oasis of Siwa. There, the oracle, according to widespread tradition, confirmed his divine descent, telling Alexander that he was the son of Zeus himself, or Amun, who in Egyptian mythology was identified with the Greek Zeus. This event had enormous psychological and political significance. Not only did it instantly raise his status in the eyes of the Egyptians, who were accustomed to worshipping their rulers as gods, but it also greatly strengthened the faith in him among his own Greek and Macedonian soldiers, to whom the idea of a heroic son of a god or demigod was familiar and inspiring. If the supreme god Zeus or Amun himself favored their general, then his victories were predestined, his commands were truth, and his destiny was to become the master of the world. This inspired in his army an unshakable confidence, a fanatical devotion, and a willingness to follow him into the farthest and most dangerous corners of the known world. It is important to understand that using this trick did not always require a direct relationship with the gods. Leaders could claim to have a special, unique connection with the deities, that they received direct signs, prophetic dreams, or even personal messages from the gods or ancestral spirits. Various religious figures played a huge role in this process. Priests, prophets, shamans, oracles, all of them acted as authoritative intermediaries between the world of people and the world of the supernatural. Leaders actively used their authority and prophecies to legitimize their actions. For example, in the Roman tradition, augurs, divining priests, predicted the future and interpreted the will of the gods from the flight of birds, the behavior of sacred chickens, or the entrails of sacrificial animals. Their conclusions could be decisive and influence the most important state decisions. The beginning of military campaigns, the conclusion of alliances, the holding of elections, or even the abolition of popular assemblies. Dishonest or cunning leaders could order or interpret favorable predictions in such a way as to justify their political actions, suppress opposition, or motivate the people to take the actions they wanted. Rituals and symbols played a colossal, almost non-verbal role in this context, which was understood by everyone. Lavish religious ceremonies, grand sacrifices, solemn processions dedicated to gods and heroes, as well as the construction of magnificent temples, altars, and religious buildings. All this served as a constant and visual reminder of the leader's inseparable connection with the divine. When the Roman emperor, who also bore the sacred title of Supreme Pontiff, personally performed a public sacrifice or presided over a religious festival, this was not simply the performance of his state duties. It was a powerful theatrical act of affirming his sacred role, demonstrating that he was a link, a living bridge between the mortal world and the world of the gods. The common people, watching these majestic and awe-inspiring performances, felt themselves involved in something grand, sacred, and eternal, and their leader seemed the unshakable embodiment of the divine will on earth. These rituals evoked deep reverence, inspired awe, suppressed any critical thinking, and reinforced the collective sense of unity and faith in the immutability of the existing order. Even in situations where an explicit divine origin was not asserted or accepted by the culture, leaders could skillfully resort to symbols of good fortune, special favors of the gods, or the interpretation of omens. A successful battle won against all expectations, an unexpected and brilliant victory over a superior enemy, favorable weather conditions that contributed to the success of a military campaign or harvest, or even a miraculous healing of the leader himself. or someone close to him. All these events could be presented as a direct sign of approval and favor from higher powers. This created an aura of invincibility, chosenness, and special great destiny around the leader, forcing people to believe in his infallibility and unsinkability. Leaders who were able to read signs of nature, interpret dreams as messages from the gods, or even claim direct personal communication with the deities, acquired enormous, almost mystical influence, since people believed that only they possessed this unique gift to understand the true path and save society from troubles. Beyond the purely religious context, this trick involved more subtle psychological elements. Leaders could use abstract but lofty concepts, giving them a quasi-religious meaning to justify their actions and strengthen their power. Concepts such as absolute justice, manifest destiny, the greatness of the people, historical mission, or inevitable progress could be used to create the sense that the leader's actions were part of some higher design beyond human judgment. If a leader claimed that his decisions were dictated by the deepest interests of the fatherland or the sacred future of his descendants, this created in the minds of the masses a feeling that he was acting not for personal gain, ambition, or self-interest, but in the name of something much greater, sacred, and inviolable. This significantly reduced the critical perception of his actions and strengthened his position as a selfless servant of a higher purpose. Thus, tying their power to a divine or supernatural source allowed ancient leaders not only to rule their subjects, but to instill in them the deepest reverence, absolute and unquestioning obedience, and even sacred fear. After all, to rebel against such a leader whose power was granted from above meant going against the gods themselves, violating the fundamental world order, and this, as people believed, promised inevitable misfortunes not only to the rebel himself, but also to his entire family and even to the entire society. This created a powerful psychological barrier, stronger than any human law or army, because it was based on deeply rooted beliefs and fears. It was this trick that gave ancient leaders a legitimacy that was unquestionable, ensuring the stability of governance over centuries and millennia, because it came from the universe itself, not from human consent. We know that ancient leaders who ruled societies where the vast majority of the population was illiterate, and information traveled very slowly and was often distorted, understood and made full use of the enormous power of symbols and rituals. And this is the third trick. In a world where the written word was the privilege of a few and oral messages could easily lose their meaning, symbols spoke to people in a universal language, a language of feelings, associations, and collective memory, a language understood by all without exception and requiring no translation. Flags, emblems, insignia, special uniforms, characteristic gestures, grandiose architectural structures, and even specific hairstyles were not just decorative elements, but powerful tools that created a profound visual and emotional impact. They served the purpose of uniting disparate individuals into a single, cohesive community, and no less important, strengthening and legitimizing the leader's power. Consider, for example, the impressive image of the Roman legions. Their battle standards with the golden eagle, their distinctive, recognizable from afar armor, Lorica segmentata, their perfectly organized and disciplined formation in which each soldier was part of a single whole. All this was not only practical for fighting, but also carried the deepest symbolic meaning. The eagle of the legion was sacred. It was considered the living embodiment of the spirit of the legion and of the Roman state itself. Its loss in battle was the greatest unthinkable shame, tantamount to the destruction of military honor. Each soldier, seeing these symbols, felt himself part of something much greater than himself, the great, invincible, and eternal power of Rome. These symbols instantly evoked a feeling of pride, belonging, unshakable faith in the power of their army and their homeland. They evoked a strong emotional reaction, bypassing logical understanding, directly influencing the subconscious. The army, united by common symbols, became not just a collection of people, but a living embodiment of the state, capable of incredible fortitude and feats. Rituals worked on a similar principle, but with added dynamics and interactivity. Religious festivals, ceremonial military parades, public executions demonstrating the power of justice, or lavish triumphal processions. All these events were not spontaneous events, but carefully planned performances. They carried deep sacred or political meaning and served as a powerful tool for strengthening the existing order and demonstrating the power of authority. For example, the Roman triumph was a grandiose, multi-hour spectacle, carefully designed for maximum psychological effect. It included the passage of the victorious commander in a purple toga, captives from the conquered peoples, huge carts loaded with treasures and trophies, images of defeated cities and gods, and a solemn march of victorious legionaries adorned with laurel wreaths. The crowds lining the streets rejoiced, feeling themselves involved in a great victory, in the power of their state and in the greatness of their leader. Such rituals strengthened in people a sense of unity, a common destiny, collective pride and personal attachment to the leader who brought them this glory and well-being. They erased social differences for a time, uniting everyone in a single burst of celebration. Monumental architecture also played the role of a gigantic, silent, but incredibly powerful symbol. The colossal pyramids of Egypt, the majestic temples of Greece and Rome, the gigantic amphitheaters, triumphal arches, the grandiose statues of gods and rulers, all these structures were designed not only to satisfy functional needs, but also, first of all, to overwhelm a person with their scale and remind him of the omnipotence of the ruler, his dynasty, or the unshakable power of the gods. An ordinary person, standing next to such an architectural marvel, felt small, insignificant in the face of this overwhelming power. This evoked deep reverence, awe, and reinforced the idea of the immutability and grandeur of the existing order, which was created and maintained by higher powers or their chosen ones. These structures were the visual embodiment of power. Symbols were also actively used to clearly separate and mark us and them. Certain clothes, insignia, tattoos, brands, or even specific hairstyles and beards could instantly distinguish one group from another. This simplified the process of identification, both for the leader himself and for the masses, and helped to effectively channel collective emotions: love and loyalty to us, suspicion and hostility to them. For example, an enemy warrior could be depicted on frescoes or coins with certain symbols or characteristics in order to more easily evoke negative associations, fear or disgust in the crowd, justifying any action against him. The differences in clothing between patricians and plebeians, between freemen and slaves, between citizens and foreigners, all these were symbols that did not need words to explain the social status and place of a person in the hierarchy. In addition, rituals and symbols served to continually reproduce and reinforce ideology. Annual celebrations of the founding of a city or victory in war, rituals of taking oaths of allegiance, ceremonies of coronation or election, all of this was aimed at constantly reminding people of the values on which their society was based and of the place of the leader in this system. The more often these symbols and rituals were repeated, the deeper they penetrated the collective consciousness, becoming an integral part of the identity of each member of society. They acted as a powerful anchor, holding people within the framework of established norms and ideas about the world. Symbols and rituals were thus not simply part of the culture of ancient societies. They were a complex and incredibly effective non-verbal language of power. They spoke directly to people's emotions, bypassing rational thought, creating strong bonds, a deep sense of belonging and, crucially, virtually unquestioning obedience. Leaders who skillfully used this language could not only shape the collective consciousness, but also subtly direct the actions of the crowd, motivating it to sacrifice, heroism, or silent decision-making, sometimes without uttering a single order out loud, but only using the power of symbolic influence. It was a form of governance based on an intuitive, rather than an intellectual perception of the world. Ancient leaders, whether intuitively or consciously, were masters of myth-making, and this was the fourth psychological trick. They understood that to control the masses effectively and in the long term, force or fear alone was not enough. They had to give the people something more: a shared history, a common worldview, a sense of belonging to a greater cause, and an explanation of their place in the world and their purpose. Myths and legends, unlike dry facts, spoke directly to the soul, shaping the collective consciousness and strengthening the leader's power base for generations to come. These stories did not have to be true in the modern historical sense. What was more important was that they were compelling, inspiring, emotionally charged, and, crucially, consistent with the deepest values, aspirations of the people. Myths gave people a unified picture of the world, explained their origins, predicted the future, and, most importantly, legitimized and justified the existing social order, hierarchy, and power of the ruling elite. One of the most striking examples of this tactic are the myths about the origins of cities and entire nations. Every great civilization had its own founding legend that endowed it with a special, often divine mission. Let us recall the famous Roman legend of Romulus and Remus, twin brothers suckled by a she-wolf who founded Rome. This story did more than explain the physical origins of the city. It gave it a heroic, almost divine quality, emphasizing its special destiny, its unique right to rule the world. For every Roman, knowledge of this legend was more than just historical fact. It was part of his identity, part of what it meant to be a Roman, a citizen of the great republic and then of the empire. It provided a profound sense of pride, unity, and an unshakable sense of belonging to a great nation whose destiny had been written before it even came into being. Such myths of heroic founders or divine descent, such as the myths of the founding kings of Mesopotamia or the divine lineages of the pharaohs of Egypt, provided a powerful foundation for national consciousness and imperial ambitions. Ancient leaders, whether kings, emperors, or generals, often skillfully wove themselves and their dynasties into these myths. They either claimed direct kinship with gods or legendary heroes, or they positioned themselves as fulfilling a great mission preordained by fate. For example, many dynasties in China claimed for centuries to have received the mandate of heaven, as we have already mentioned. This not only solidified their right to the throne, but also created a sense that their rule was part of a greater cosmic order bestowed from above. Each emperor, upon ascending the throne, symbolically accepted this mandate, becoming not just a ruler, but a mediator between heaven and earth, a guarantor of harmony under heaven. If the emperor lost the mandate, which could manifest itself in natural disasters, crop failures, rebellions, or military defeats, this provided the people and potential opposition with a legitimate justification for overthrowing him. Thus, the myth of the mandate of heaven served not only to strengthen power, but also to explain its cyclical loss, while maintaining the basic belief system and legitimacy of power itself. Myths were also widely used to glorify the exploits of not only the current leader, but also his great ancestors. Tales of heroic battles, where one general single-handedly put an entire army to flight, of wise decisions made at a critical moment that saved the country from destruction, of incredible discoveries or inventions attributed to the ruling dynasty. All this created an aura around the image of an invincible, omniscient, wise, or enlightened ruler. These stories were not simply passed on by word of mouth. They became part of oral folklore, epic poems, songs, and tales, passing from generation to generation and shaping public opinion. The glorification of a leader or an entire clan made his figure almost inviolable, inspiring the people to unquestioning loyalty, dedication, and even sacrifice in the name of his ideals or goals. The myth of the leader's personal valor and supernatural abilities was a powerful motivator for soldiers on the battlefield and for citizens in peaceful life. One of the most subtle and powerful forms of myth-making was the creation of the concept of a golden age, an idealized vision of a glorious past. It might be a time of valiant ancestors, when everything was absolutely fair, abundant, and prosperous, when people lived in harmony with the gods and nature, and all problems were alien. A leader could promise to bring back this golden age, to offer a utopian vision of the future, which would be nothing more than a revival of long-lost greatness. This gave people not just hope, but a specific, bright, and inspiring goal for which it was worth enduring current adversity, enduring hardships, and unquestioningly following their ruler. They believed that under his wise leadership, they would not only survive, but would also certainly return to their lost prosperity and greatness. Such a myth was especially effective in times of crisis, war, or social upheaval, when people were in dire need of consolation and perspective. Thus, myths and legends were not simply a collection of entertaining or didactic stories. They were fundamental building blocks of ancient societies, forming collective memory, deep cultural identity, moral principles, and an unshakable faith in their destiny and their rulers. Ancient leaders, being talented storytellers and engineers of souls, skillfully used this subtle and powerful tool to create lasting loyalty, maintain order, and control vast masses of people over many centuries and even millennia. Finally, in a world without modern mass media, ancient leaders were nonetheless masters of information control and incredibly adept at playing on the most powerful and fundamental human emotions: fear and hope. They understood that whoever controls the flow of news, rumors, gossip, and even historical narratives effectively controls the minds and hearts of people. Their power was based on the creation of a carefully constructed reality in the minds of their subjects. Control of information manifested itself in several key ways, each of which reinforced the leader's influence. First, there was the monopolization of the news source. The leader or his carefully selected confidants, e.g., messengers, priests, scribes, or specially trained heralds, became the main and sometimes the only official purveyors of true information. Recall how messengers brought news of great victories, often embellished, or minor defeats, often downplayed. Priests interpreted the will of the gods, and courtiers spread the necessary rumors and gossip that could elevate some and denigrate others. The words of these mouthpieces of power were rarely questioned, since there were no alternative sources of information. Any message that contradicted the official version could be instantly declared false, slanderous, treasonous, or even blasphemous, which discouraged people from spreading or believing incorrect information. Ancient libraries and archives could also be used to rewrite history, remove undesirable facts, and exalt the ruling dynasty. Secondly, it was a skillful filtering and purposeful distortion of information. Ancient leaders did not hesitate to embellish their victories to epic proportions and to downplay defeats to minor incidents. Failures could be attributed to the actions of internal or external enemies, to treacherous betrayal, to an unfavorable position of the stars, or even to the wrath of the gods, which, as we have already discussed, increased fear and submission. Successes, on the contrary, were maximally exaggerated and attributed entirely to the wisdom, foresight, personal courage, and divine patronage of the leader himself. If a country was suffering from famine due to crop failure, it could be announced that the neighbors were doing even worse, or that this was a temporary test sent by the gods to strengthen the spirit of the people. Such a presentation of information created a distorted but convenient for the authorities picture of the world, where the leader was always right and always acted for the good. Parallel to the control of information was the manipulation of fear. The threat of invasion by powerful enemies, inevitable famine, devastating epidemics, the wrath of the gods for disobedience, or even internal conspiracies, all these fears could be greatly amplified, dramatized, and used to immediately rally the population around the leader. When people experience great fear, they instinctively seek protection and are ready to unconditionally obey anyone who promises them this protection and safety. The leader could deliberately exaggerate the danger in order to justify his harsh and sometimes cruel measures. The introduction of exorbitant taxes, mass conscription into the army, the suppression of any manifestations of discontent. The statement, "Only I can save you from this nightmare, only I know how to avoid death," was a powerful tool for maintaining and strengthening power. This also included public punishment, from exile to death. It served not only as a punishment, but also as a visual terrifying lesson, a constant reminder of the terrible consequences of disobedience, instilling deep, paralyzing fear and maintaining the strictest order. These public spectacles were carefully staged for maximum psychological impact on the crowd. However, ancient leaders understood that fear alone could not rule for long. They had to give people hope as well. Manipulating hope was just as important, and sometimes even more so. Leaders regularly promised their subjects a golden age, an era of prosperity, peace, justice, and abundance. They might promise fertile lands after successfully conquering new territories, an end to famine after a rich harvest, even if it was not so rich, or the continued favor of the gods in the event of absolute obedience and loyalty. These promises gave people a bright, attractive goal for which to endure current adversity, endure hardship, and unquestioningly follow their ruler. Hope is a powerful motivator, capable of making unimaginable sacrifices, performing the most difficult and dangerous tasks, and remaining loyal even in the darkest times. Creating false expectations or exaggerated prospects was also part of this subtle arsenal. For example, after a long and exhausting war, when the morale of the army and the population was at its lowest, a leader might promise a quick and grand victory, promising untold riches and eternal glory, to raise morale and prevent mass desertion or rebellion. Such promises, even if they were not fully realized or only partially realized, helped to keep the situation under control at critical moments by giving the people something to believe in. Spreading rumors about the untold riches that awaited the people after victory or about miraculous cures granted by the ruler served the same purpose. Thus, control over what people hear, see, and, as a consequence, believe, as well as skillful and purposeful use of their basic, most powerful emotions, animal fear for survival and bright hope for a better future, allowed ancient leaders to be real puppeteers of truth. They did not simply rule their subjects, they constructed an entire reality for them, directing huge crowds in the direction they needed. In this skillfully created reality, their power seemed natural, inevitable, necessary, and absolutely legitimate, and any doubt about it, madness or a crime. These techniques, developed and honed thousands of years ago in conditions very different from our own, are remarkably universal and, unfortunately, remain relevant even in today's world. They show how deeply ancient rulers understood human nature, its vulnerabilities, its desire for security, belonging, and meaning. From the pharaohs of ancient Egypt, who were considered living gods, to the Roman emperors who ruled vast empires. From wise or cruel tribal leaders to great generals who conquered continents, they all, consciously or intuitively, used these sophisticated psychological techniques. They used them to unite disparate groups, motivate incredible feats, and keep vast crowds in line, thereby shaping the course of history and leaving an indelible and sometimes frightening mark on the annals of humanity. Studying these tricks not only enhances our understanding of the past, but also provides valuable lessons about the mechanisms of social influence that continue to operate today.